The submitted materials forcefully argue that SAP tax configuration must stop being a simple setup task and become a strategic architectural decision, especially as we shift toward external compliance platforms in a real-time regulatory world. So let's jump right into the feedback, starting with the fact that the alignment between the specific configuration failures and the broader macro-environmental shifts needs tighter integration to fully elevate the stakes.
I am so glad we're starting exactly there because, the foundational argument in this text is incredibly strong, but the way it's currently structured, it kind of diffuses its own impact.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the text cleanly divides its arguments right down the middle into two separate buckets. So in the first half, we get this highly granular, almost surgical breakdown of the specific technical failures. Things like text code proliferation, hard-coded rates, outdated determination logic.
The real micro stuff.
Exactly. But then, completely walled off in the second half, it pivots to these massive industry shifts, like continuous transaction controls, or CTCs, the sheer velocity of new government mandates, and the insatiable data needs of enterprise AI.
Right, and by physically separating that granular what is going wrong at the technical level from the macro why it matters so much more right now, the argument loses its visceral punch. The stakes of those micro failures just feel entirely disconnected from the existential threats of the macro environment.
Which is the whole point of the piece.
Exactly. To put it another way, it's like reading a report that details a leaky hull in Chapter 1, and then, in Chapter 2, describes a massive approaching hurricane. To truly understand the danger, the reader needs to see the water rushing through the leak because of the hurricane. We have to marry the technical flaw directly to the environmental pressure.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. I wonder, though, if we've considered just how much more compelling the argument becomes when the macro consequences are positioned as direct symptoms of the micro failures.
So, weaving them together.
Right. What if we weave those macro factors directly into the breakdown of the three specific failures? If we do that, we show exactly how these old habits trigger modern catastrophes. The reader would instantly understand why an outdated setup isn't just an annoyance for the IT department, but like a critical system vulnerability for the entire business.
Let's play that out practically. If I'm reading the section on tax code proliferation without governance, the text currently talks about upgrade risks and basic compliance risks.
Which is true.
It's totally true, but it feels a bit conventional. How do we tie that specifically to the enterprise AI data needs mentioned later in the text?
Well, we show the mechanics of the failure. Enterprise AI relies on pristine, canonical data standards to actually function, right? So imagine an enterprise AI system attempting to run predictive analytics on global margin leakage.
Okay.
If that AI looks at the SAP system and sees a profoundly messy taxonomy, let's say 50 different inactive, overlapping, or custom-built tax codes created by 5 different consulting firms over the last decade, it just sees absolute noise.
It degrades the data layer entirely.
Precisely. A proliferated tax code taxonomy doesn't just make an SAP upgrade slightly more annoying. It actively corrupts the foundational data layers that modern AI systems require to generate business intelligence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you tie the micro habit of creating a quick custom tax code to the macro failure of blinding the company's AI initiatives.
I like that, but let me push back just a little bit. If I'm an SAP finance consultant in the trenches, I know tax codes get messy. That's just the reality of a 10-year-old system. Am I really losing sleep over the C-suite's AI predictive analytics?
Maybe not directly on a Tuesday afternoon, no, but the project sponsors who sign off on your architecture budget absolutely are. And if this text wants to elevate tax design to a strategic level, it has to speak the language of the executives funding the digital transformation.
That's a great point.
Right. If the text points out that sloppy tax configuration breaks the multi-million-dollar AI investment, well, the consultant suddenly has the leverage to demand cleaner architecture.
You were giving the consultant the ammunition they need to get buy-in. Okay, let's look at the second major failure then. Hard-coded tax rates. How do we fuse that with the macro shift of mandate velocity?
Currently, the text warns that hard-coded rates require developer time to change. That's true, but again, it's a minor headache. What if we look at it from the perspective of system uptime in a real-time regulatory environment?
You mean when governments mandate live invoice reporting, like we're seeing all over Europe and Latin America right now?
Exactly. Let's briefly explain the mechanism here for a second. Traditionally, SAP consultants might hard-code a tax rate into an FTXP entry. FTXP being the transaction code in SAP used to maintain tax codes and their corresponding percentage rates.
Right.
In the old batch processing world, if a country changed a tax rate, you had a few weeks to update FTXP, transport it through your development and quality landscapes, push it to production, and you were completely fine.
But with continuous transaction controls, the government is essentially standing in the middle of your transaction in real time.
Right. When Brazil, Poland, and Malaysia are all shifting their CTC mandates simultaneously, a hard-coded rate isn't just a maintenance chore. It directly causes system downtime.
Because of the mismatch.
Yes, if the rate in FTXP doesn't perfectly match the external government API, at the exact millisecond the invoice is generated, the invoice is rejected by the government system.
And if the invoice is rejected by the government,
The truck literally cannot leave the loading dock. Commerce halts entirely, illustrating how hard-coding FTXP entries directly causes a frozen supply chain when dealing with the rapid pace of global mandates. That transforms us from a dry, technical critique into a flashing red warning light for the operations director.
so by fusing them, we give the reader the cause and the catastrophic effect in the exact same breath. We've established that a frozen supply chain is a terrifying macro consequence. But let's say the IT director reads this, totally buys in, and the architectural redesign gets greenlit. Now what?
That actually leads us to the blueprint phase, where the gap between the conceptual demand for new architecture and the practical reality of execution requires a concrete bridging framework.
Yes, this is probably the most critical missing link in the entire document. The text transitions beautifully from diagnosing the problem to demanding a new, robust standard. It emphatically states that the API integration interface must be defined before configuration begins.
Right, and that proper testing requires validating against actual CTC platforms.
Which sounds fantastic in a vacuum. But as I read this, I kept wondering, where is the map? The text demands a massive paradigm shift, but doesn't really hand the practitioner the actionable methodology to navigate it within a highly pressurized standard project timeline.
It just leaves them hanging.
Exactly. It leaves this massive void between theoretical design and daily execution. The vision for cross-team collaboration between indirect tax specialists and SAP technical specialists is wonderful. But in the reality of an implementation project where everyone is constantly behind schedule, how does that actually happen?
Yeah. What's step one? Without a methodology, they will just revert to what they know.
I hear you, but let me play devil's advocate for a second here. If we start adding rigid architectural steps to the blueprint phase, aren't we just going to bottleneck the project? Consultants are under immense pressure to deliver agile configurations quickly. If we force them to stop and define abstract integration layers up front, won't project managers push back and just say, hey, build it the old way so we can hit our milestone?
Oh, they will absolutely push back, which is exactly why the text needs to provide a practical, step-by-step implementation checkpoint system. If you just give them a philosophy, the project manager will overrule it for the sake of speed.
That makes sense.
But if you give them a methodology, like a standardized checklist that proves they are mitigating risk, it becomes part of the project's operational DNA.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of that. What does this bridging framework actually look like in practice? How do we anchor these profound architectural insights into the localized reality of a project plan?
One highly effective addition would be a compliance-first blueprinting checklist. This checklist would require a mock API contract sign-off between the SAP finance team and the external compliance platform team before any standard tax code configuration is even authorized to begin.
A hard gate in the methodology. I like that. You literally cannot open the configuration menu in SAP until both teams agree on the exact identifiers, the data payloads, and the output document standards required by the external engine.
Exactly. It completely operationalizes the text's core principle of defining the integration interface early. It forces that cross-team collaboration the text asks for, taking it out of the realm of theory and placing it squarely onto the project manager's timeline.
And what about the testing phase? The material points out that standard positive case testing, essentially just making sure the system works when everything goes right, is totally inadequate for a real-time compliance environment.
Yes, standard positive testing is practically useless when a government API is dictating your operational uptime. The tax needs to provide a concrete testing technique to solve this. For instance, it just suggests the use of sandbox external compliance APIs to deliberately simulate real-time rejection during standard positive case testing.
Wait, really? So you want them to intentionally throw errors during the happy path testing?
Yes, by hooking up a sandbox API that randomly or even systematically throws rejection codes saying, the government format is wrong or the rate is invalid, you force the SAP technical teams and the tax specialists to immediately confront what happens when the system breaks. It forces them to build robust error handling workflows.
I see. Because in a continuous transaction control model, an inadequate setup means transactions are rejected instantly.
Instantly.
If they only test the happy path, the first time they experience a real-time rejection will be in a live production environment, which brings us right back to the frozen supply chain we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
So by handing the reader these specific tools, a blueprinting checklist and a sandbox rejection protocol, we elevate the text from a compelling theoretical white paper to an indispensable operational manual.
It proves the material's point physically. It demonstrates the tax is no longer a localized setup task, but a deeply integrated architectural flow that requires physical checkpoints.
Now, handing someone an operational manual assumes they are open to receiving it, which means the authoritative tone bordering on lecturing risks alienating the exact practitioners whose behavior the text aims to change.
Oof. Yeah, this is a delicate balance, isn't it? The urgency in the writing is palpable, and it's clearly driven by a deep expertise. It is actively trying to wake people up to a very real danger.
And the urgency is a fantastic hook. I mean, we need that. But the material occasionally adopts a highly confrontational posture toward the reader, using phrases like, "You're configuring SAP tax like it's 2010," and warning that their standard habits are producing compliance debt.
Right.
It places the consultant in the role of the unwitting villain who is recklessly building fragile systems.
Is there a risk, though, that by focusing so heavily on compliance debt, the text is overlooking a fundamental reality of the industry? I mean, these consultants are highly experienced. They have built entire careers on these methods. In many cases, they are applying exactly what they were rigorously trained to do by the major software integrators.
Right. They aren't inherently making mistakes. They are executing a legacy approach flawlessly.
Yes.
If we attack their deeply ingrained, traditionally successful methods, it might trigger an immediate defensive reaction. They might just close the document and reject the message entirely before absorbing any of the profound architectural insights we just discussed. If you alienate the architect, the building never gets redesigned.
So how do we fix that without losing the necessary punch? We can't just soften the text into irrelevance. The danger of outdated configuration is real, so we can't pretend it's fine.
We pivot the framing. We shift from a critique of their outdated habits to an empowerment narrative. We want to position the consultant as the heroic architect of future-proofed enterprise systems. We have to validate their past expertise while inviting them to upgrade their toolkit for the modern era.
I like that.
We want the consultant to feel like they are being handed a superpower, not a reprimand.
I love that shift in perspective. Instead of saying, you are doing this wrong, we say, the world has changed and you need a new set of tools to conquer it. How do we actually manifest that in the text itself, though?
Well, first, we can tweak the headers. Instead of the aggressive, the configuration habit that is creating compliance debt, we frame it around evolution. Upgrading your configuration toolkit for the real-time era.
That immediately lowers the defenses. It maintains the premise that their current toolkit is no longer sufficient, but frames it as a professional upgrade rather than a professional failing.
Exactly. Furthermore, we need to explicitly state that the 2010 method was an objective masterclass in configuration for its time. The text should actually spend a sentence or two praising the elegance of a perfectly mapped legacy tax procedure from a decade ago.
Oh, that is a brilliant psychological move. By validating the elegance of what they built in the past, you earn the right to critique its utility in the present.
Yes, exactly. We frame the transition not as correcting a mistake, but as mastering an entirely new discipline. Moving to a clean core architecture and embracing external compliance integration makes them an elite, highly sought-after expert today.
What are the potential limitations to that idea, though? If we validate the old way too heavily, do we lose the urgency to adopt the new way?
Not if we tie it back to our first point, the macro environment. You tell them that the external environment mutated overnight with AI and continuous transaction controls. You are offering them the keys to remaining indispensable in a world driven by those forces. You validate the practitioner, which is the absolute fastest way to get them to champion your new architecture.
That completely changes the narrative arc of the reader. The consultant goes from being the purveyor of compliance debt to the hero who rescues the enterprise's digital transformation by integrating tax strategy directly into the core architectural blueprint.
Yep.
If they feel empowered, they are going to finish reading this material and immediately forward it to their project managers, saying we need to change our methodology. But if they feel insulted, that document goes straight to the trash.
Which is exactly what we want to avoid. To summarize, this critique explored how to maximize the impact of this highly robust SAP architecture material. The primary takeaways are, first, fuse the micro-configuration failures directly with the macro-environmental threats like AI and continuous transaction controls to show true causation.
Right.
Second, provide a concrete step-by-step bridging framework, like a mandatory API sign-off and sandbox testing for the blueprint phase to ensure the design can actually survive a standard project timeline. And finally, shift the tone from critiquing legacy habits to empowering the consultant with a modern toolkit.
The foundational insights in this source material are truly exceptional. By making these structural and tonal adjustments, it has the potential to fundamentally change how global implementation teams approach this critical interface.
Absolutely. The listener is highly encouraged to refine these materials and submit them back to us for further exploration in a future critique. Because ultimately, if you are going to build an enterprise system on top of a continuously shifting tectonic fault line, you want your architects feeling empowered to design the most resilient, flexible foundation possible.